These are a copy of the notes from the Bible study at North Shields Evangelical Church. They're based on the tough sayings of Jesus. And this week we look at the words of Jesus in Mark 9, verses 42 to 50. I'm going to read those words now. Jesus said, "If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them if a large millstone were hung around their neck and they were thrown into the sea. If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life maimed than with 2 hands to go into hell, where the fire never goes out. And if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life crippled than to have 2 feet and to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and to be thrown into hell, where the worms that eat them do not die, and the fire is not quenched. Everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if you lose its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? Have salt among yourselves, and be at peace with each other." In our series on the tough sayings of Jesus, this has to be one of the most toughest. What Jesus is saying is tough to hear, it's controversial, and it's tough to apply practically to our lives. Did Jesus really mean his words to be taken literally? If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. If your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. If you've ever heard anyone teach on this passage before, you can almost guarantee that within the first 2 minutes, they'll explain how Jesus did not mean what he said literally. He wasn't literally asking us to cut off our hands and cut off our feet. However, in the first 2 pages of one of his books, Bonhoeffer, a German theologian, asks this question. Bonhoeffer says, if we took Jesus' words literally, would the conclusion be the same? Is it better for you to enter life maimed than with 2 hands to go into hell? Is it better for you to enter life crippled than to have 2 feet and to be thrown into hell? Even if we had to cut through flesh, nerves and bone in order to keep ourselves from stumbling, the conclusion would still be the same. It is better for you to enter life maimed than with 2 hands to go into hell. It is better for you to enter life crippled than to have 2 feet and to be thrown into hell. All that effort, agony and searing loss would still be worth it. That's how serious an issue this thing called sin is. So, if Jesus' metaphor is literally true, as well as metaphorically true, if Jesus' metaphor is literally true as well as metaphorically true, then surely the application of this metaphor will involve literal effort, agony, and loss. In our effort to cut sin off in our lives should involve effort, pain, and involve sacrifices, and it may involve a significant sense of loss. So to help us to understand these verses a bit more, the effort that they're calling to us, I want to ask 5 simple questions. What, why, when, how, where, and who. I'll be doing 2 of those things together. So firstly, what? These verses come in a context that suggests a figurative interpretation. As we've seen several times before, context is crucial to understanding Jesus' words. These words in chapter 9 come after what Jesus said in chapter 7. In chapter 7 of Mark's Gospel, Jesus says this. Jesus went on, "What comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil comes. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All of these evils come from inside and defile a person. In other words, it's not the hand or the foot or the eye that is the root cause of our sin. Sinful desires arise in the heart. So cutting off our eyes or feet and hands will not end our sinful desires. Jesus said something similar in his Sermon on the Mount, where he said, if your right hand causes you to sin, chop it off and throw it away. It is better to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Yet again, these words come in the context of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where he says that the root cause of sin is in the heart. That's why he regards anger as like murder. That's why he regards lust as the same as adultery. Because anger and lust exist in the heart, and they lead to the outward action of murder or adultery. And so if sin arises in the heart, literally cutting off our hands and feet and eyes won't cure us of the problem of sin. So what is Jesus calling us to do? If he's not calling us to literally cut off our hands, what is he calling us to do? Well, I recently watched the film 127 Hours. If you get a chance, watch it. It follows the true story of Aaron Ralston, who falls down a canyon in Utah, the USA. During his fall, his arm gets stuck under a boulder, and he spends 127 hours fruitlessly trying to pull his arm out, until eventually he realizes that in order to survive, he has to amputate his own arm. The scene where he uses the blade of his penknife to amputate his own arm, cutting through flesh, then muscle, then nerves, then bone. That scene is very painful to watch. I think Jesus, when he uses these words, is saying the same. He's saying that to cut off sin in our lives will involve the same amount of determination and discipline as Aaron in 127 hours. To deal with sin in our lives, we can expect to experience pain, agony, or we can expect to exert effort and self-determination. Jesus is calling us to a radical fight with the sin in our lives. But why? Why is Jesus calling us to fight with sin in our lives? Well, Jesus' words are addressed to his disciples, which might seem strange that Jesus is talking to his disciples about hell. Why is Jesus linking the dangers of sin to the dangers of hell? Isn't the sin of the believer forgiven? Hasn't the Christian been saved? I don't know about you, but as a Christian I consider myself as if done all that is needed to avoid hell. I've put my faith in Jesus, who died for all my sins, and I've been saved from eternal damnation as a result. Am I safe from the fires of hell? I'd tick yes. So surely I don't need to take the sin in my life as seriously as Jesus makes out. But one word in Matthew chapter 5 really made me reconsider how safe I was as a Christian. If your right hand causes you to sin, chop it off and throw it away. Why do you need to chop off your hand and throw it away? You know, if your hand had a cancer in it, would you be safer if you cut it off? Or would you be safer if you cut it off and threw it away? Why is then, if you cut it off, it's equally as safe as if you cut it off and throw it away. So why does Jesus call us to cut off our hand and throw it away? Maybe It's so that Jesus uses the word throw it away, so that we'd make the connection between Jesus' first use of the word throw and his second use of the word throw. Maybe that's the connection Jesus wants us to make. If your right hand causes you to sin, chop it off and throw it away. It is better to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Maybe Jesus is saying, you do the throwing away before the throwing gets done to you. You have to do something about sin whilst you have the power to, before you are powerless to do anything about it. You practice self-control before you lose control. To put that in practical language, end that relationship with the non-Christian before you are so in love that you cannot pull yourself away. Deal with the bitterness towards that fellow Christian before you're so consumed by that bitterness that you end up turning your back on them, and then the church, and then Jesus. Practice self-control when it comes to the world and its treasures, before materialistic desires control your time and control your thoughts and your engagement with the church. Get control of your lusts. Turn off that porn. Stop flirting with that person before lustful desires get control over you and they have a hold on you that you cannot break. Every sin has the potential to take me further from Christ, even to the point where I might give up on my faith in Christ entirely. And there's no shortage of examples to prove that point. Therefore, you and I need to do something early about every sin and temptation in our lives, because that's the only way to be biblically safe from the powers of hell. Every sin has the potential to lead us astray. So that's the what we're to do, that's the why we're to do it, and let's look at the when. When does Jesus teach us that we should do something about sin and temptation? When does Jesus urge us to do something about sin and temptation? Well, in my life I've been on a lot of fire safety training courses. And those fire safety training courses, they're never as exciting as an episode of Fireman Sam. In those fire safety training courses, I never get to see a big fire engine arrive with its big hose. I'm never taught how to put out big fires. My fire safety training always involves fire prevention rather than fire cure. It's so much better to deal with potential hazards than with actual hazardous fires. It's so much better to learn how to dispose of hot barbecue coals rather than learning how many buckets of water it takes to put out a fire in a wheelie bin. It's so much better to deal with fires early on than later on. Notice the type of fire Jesus refers to in verse 43. If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life maimed than with 2 hands to go into hell, where the fire never goes out. The fires of hell are unquenchable. No amount of fire engines can put them out. So it is so much better to deal with every sin in our lives early on. Why? Because every sin has the potential to lead us astray, to cause us to give up our faith on Christ, if it gets a hold on us. We're to take sin in our life seriously, so it doesn't grow into the point where it causes us to turn our back on God entirely. When are we to do something about sin in our lives? We're to do it early, so that sin doesn't grow. How? But how? How are we to do stuff about the sin in our lives? Well, in these verses in Matthew 9, Jesus asks a how question. He says, salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again. Just think about salt and pepper. If you had a bowl of salt, how easy is it to add pepper to the salt? Pretty easy. You just get the pepper thing and you pour it into the bowl of salt. Now, how easy is it to get the pepper out of the salt? How easy is it to get that pepper out of that salt? You'd have to get your tweezers out, and even then you'd have limited success. Contaminating salt is easy. Uncontaminating it is hard. Think about our culture. Think about how many things have contaminated our culture. But once our culture has been contaminated, it's a lot harder to uncontaminate it. Or think about our lives. It's so easy for in our lives for thoughts to lead to actions, for actions to lead to a habit, for habits to lead to a character. But if you formed a habit, if you formed a character, can you simply change that character, change that habit with a thought? If you say to yourself today, I must stop doing this tomorrow, will you have stopped doing it? No. Habits stick. A thought leads to an action leads to a habit leads to a character. And so, to unreap a habit, you have to sow an action. You have to do something. To unreap a habit, you have to sow an action. You have to do something about the sin in your life. Which leads us to where and who. We saw before in chapter 7 how Jesus describes sin as arising from the heart. Yet in chapter 9, Jesus calls us to deal with this heart problem by doing something to our hands, our feet, and our eyes. Though Jesus' words are meant figuratively, the point is clear. The solution to the sin in our heart is not simply to say to ourselves, I need to change my heart, I need to stop desiring the wrong things. I don't think any of us are holy enough for that to work. Instead, to change our hearts, we need to do actual practical things to decrease our heart's exposure to temptation. We need to do actual practical things to cut the ties with the sins in our lives. The porn addict isn't simply to say, stop wanting it, stop watching it. He or she needs to cut the cord to the internet. The overly materialistic person isn't simply to say to themselves, stop being so worldly. He or she needs to cut up their credit card and write themselves a budget. We need to think about the sins that we're prone to and cut off our ties with those temptations. We need to take specific, deliberate action to cut the ties with sin in our lives. These applications will be different for all of us. But I don't think any of us can afford to not do something about the sin in our lives. We need to take control of the sin in our lives before it takes control of us.